What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at draft day tips and strategies that'll help you dominate your snake format drafts and help you walk out of your draft with one of the best rosters out there. Now, honestly, you can go ahead and follow these easy steps, whether you're a beginner or someone that's a little bit more experienced, because we all know that sometimes draft day can just go ahead and be stressful. But don't worry, we break it down in terms of the type of players you should be targeting, when you should target them, and just different types of strategies that are popular and whether they have validity or not. And on top of this, if you guys are interested in more type of this advice, then go ahead and check out the 2019 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. It's got this kind of stuff and obviously player positional rankings, player breakdowns, continuously updated. So check out the description for more info on how to get your hands on that. But with that being said, let's go ahead and deep dive our topic. So before getting into our in-draft tips, I do have a quick disclaimer, and that is in order to get the most out of these pieces of advice, ideally you will have done some homework beforehand leading up to your draft. And I would say the majority of us probably already do, but if you're in the minority, don't worry, because I'll quickly right now go over some of the easiest things that you can do to catch up to your competition in this regard. And I think we would all agree that the first thing is probably do as many mock drafts as you can, in particular on your respective platform, whether it's ESPN, NFL, Yahoo, doesn't matter. Just go ahead and use that particular platform. In addition, if you want to make your simulations as accurate as possible, go ahead and copy the league settings that you will be using. So here, I mean your league size, whether it's 8, 10, 12 people, and then also your scoring format, whether it's standard, half point PPR, or full point PPR, just doesn't matter. Go ahead and include all of that in your mock draft practice. Additionally, if you're in a league that reveals your draft order several days or weeks before the actual draft day, take advantage of that, because this can be extremely helpful. By going ahead and getting practice in that particular spot, you'll have a decent idea of, for the most part, who will be available at that juncture more often than not. And when it comes to that first round and you're on the clock for the first time, you won't be wasting all this time thinking about what player should I choose. You'll be able to confidently make your selection. Also, if you happen to be a person in a league with the same people for several years now, go ahead and take advantage of that as well, because you can really get a lot of information from the way your league has historically drafted. Because maybe you're in a league that goes running back heavy in the first round. Well, if that's the case, then you know you have to come out of the first round with an impact running back, or you're going to have a huge drop off in that position later on. So really do keep that in mind. And the last thing that I will say on this pre-draft day advice is go ahead and keep up with the news in the NFL, because I've seen it way too often. Sometimes people just don't pay attention and they'll go ahead and draft maybe a guy that has gotten injured, a guy that is potentially facing a suspension, or someone that has lost out on the starting job way too early in your draft. So don't be that guy. It's really easy to keep up with this. Just go ahead and, from time to time, check this type of information out, and particularly before your draft day as well. So as long as you keep these pieces of information in mind and go ahead and execute this leading up to your draft, you will be able to go ahead and get the most out of the advice that we will go over right now. All right, fast forward to the start of the first round. Draft day is finally here. You'll be on the clock in a little bit, and you're thinking to yourself, how do I dominate this draft? Well, let's start with this. You should continuously be keeping track of the players that are going before you and after you. Whether you're drafting online or offline with league mates and you have a big board and you're just scratching off names as you go, because in that latter example, if you're not paying attention, you run the risk of an upper echelon player dropping to you and you not even realizing it. Conversely, if you're drafting online and you try and choose someone that has already been picked, we all know what happens. You go into panic mode. You start to think, oh no, what are my other options? I haven't thought about it. And at the same time, that draft clock goes lower and lower, tick, 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 and you run the risk of it getting to double zeros, and then worst possible scenario, the computer makes an auto pick for you. That's something you want to avoid at all costs because it could very well be someone that you weren't even considering to begin with. So how do you avoid that scenario? Well, we kind of mentioned it. Have backup options to your original pick. That's why we said if you can and you know your draft spot to begin with before your draft starts, get practice there and see what players for the most part are available there because it happens every single year. One of your league mates will go ahead and reach on a player or just snipe you, and then you have to go ahead and be able to adjust because that's the name of the game here, folks. You have to be able to go into a draft realizing that it is a fluid situation. And it's tough. It really is to go into a draft and have a set strategy in mind and really just not budge from it. Have a set player in mind and say, this is who I'm going to draft no matter what, because hell, by the end of the first round, all of that could have gone to hell. And worst case scenario, if you've committed to a strategy like zero running back or zero wide receiver, I think that's one of the worst disservices you can do for yourself. I extremely discourage it because if you've just said I'm going wide receiver heavy, but a great running back has fallen to you, you should be taking that player. And honestly, if there's a strategy to follow, it's take the best player available because oftentimes that's how you're going to put the best roster together. It's going to be guys that have the highest scoring ceiling, the guys that are ranked the highest, the best available players, aka. And that begs the question, well, with best available players, where do I take them? If I feel really high on them, but there's differences in my rankings versus my platform rankings, what if it's considered a reach? Is it okay to reach? When should I reach? At what point in the draft? At what draft pick? Well, that's an interesting question, and I'll say this. Usually the positions that are most likely to be in a scenario to reach on a player, it's positions at the turn, at the start of the draft or at the end of the draft. Obviously, if you're at the start of the draft in the first round, that doesn't really apply to you, but later on it will, because after you make 2 back-to-back picks, then you're going to have to wait 20 or more choices until that next round gets back to you. So in that scenario, look, if you've identified someone that you think will be an absolute breakout, that will be a stud for one reason or another, go ahead and draft them because more than likely they won't be available for you in the next round after 20 selections have been made. And so the question becomes, well, how high is a reach okay? I usually say, within 5 to 6, maybe even 7 picks, it's okay because that player isn't going to be available because one of your league mates will likely go ahead and get them. If they're the next guy on your big board and you just know that they're not going to be there next time around, go ahead and get them. Now, obviously, I say do this intelligently because you don't want to introduce too much risk into the equation. You're not going to be drafting a guy that has a 4th round grade in the 2nd round. That's way too big of a reach. We're talking 5, 6, 7 kind of draft spot situations, not 20 plus, something like that. So when it comes to risk, you want to minimize this. And that's something that a lot of people will say to you, especially within the first 3 rounds. They'll say, look, within those first 3 picks that you make for your roster, these are going to be the guys that carry your team forward. They're going to be the highest scoring guys. And we all know it. Every single time one of our 1st or 2nd round picks has an injury scare, we hold our breath. So then it kind of makes sense to limit the selections in terms of players that have question marks around them that might be injury prone, might be facing a suspension, in order for guys that are safe. But I'm going to go ahead and kind of play devil's advocate here because I truly do, that sometimes taking a risk on a player that has a high ceiling can be a good thing. And if you hit on it, it can be extremely valuable. It can absolutely set you apart, because sometimes I do think you have to take risks, whether it's in the draft or afterwards in waivers or in trades. That's how you're going to stand out from your competition, especially if you're in these smaller or bigger leagues in one of those extremes. Now, let's use a guy like a Todd Gurley, for example, because we know he's dealing with a potential injury, arthritis in the knee, so that's docked his draft capital. Potentially now you can get him in the second round, and if he plays even 80 to 90% of what we know him to be, he's going to be a great pickup in that second round. He'll be a top 10 player that you got in the second round. So that's a steal right then and there. But if you are in that situation, let's also be smart about it, because I don't like to make too many of those risky selections. One or two is enough for me, and that second one will probably be later on. But what I'm going to immediately do if I make that type of risky selection, a la a Todd Gurley, is I'm going to go ahead and then in the third round probably take another high-end running back, because I realize at the same time that Gurley might not produce at the level I want him to. So I better get another running back that I could potentially plug in for Gurley. Or better yet, go with the handcuff approach. And I realize that a lot of people are just absolutely against handcuffs, but I don't think you should be. I've said it before. It is the ultimate insurance policy. If you have a top tier running back that has a legit backup in place that you know can be an RB1 if that former guy gets injured, why wouldn't you go ahead and draft that handcuff? Do yourself a favor. Don't be left, scrambling for a replacement in waivers, especially if it's later on in the season. You're not going to get that value. Have that handcuff to begin with. We've seen it year in and year out. Last year, we saw it with Le'Veon Bell. We didn't know what would happen with the contract situation. So I sure as hell hope you got James Conner. We've seen it with a guy like Joe Mixon. Maybe he only misses 2 games, but Giovanni Bernard during that period was an RB1. We might see it this year with a Melvin Gordon and an Austin Eckler and a Justin Jackson. We've seen it with a guy like a Kareem Hunt. So if there's bona fide backups, go ahead and get them. Get yourself that insurance policy. Now, speaking of, at what rounds we're selecting what players, let's look at maybe after the second or third round, what type of combination of players you should ideally be coming out with. Because I know a lot of people might go ahead and select a quarterback or tight end earlier on. Now, me personally, I'm against that, because I think nowadays especially, drafts have become very running back heavy. So there's going to be a big drop off at that position. So what I like to do is come out of the first 3 rounds with either 2 running backs and a wide receiver, or a running back and 2 high-end wide receivers. But if you go ahead and sub out one of those players for a quarterback or for a tight end, it might sound crazy, but we've seen it in mock drafts. We've seen it in our actual drafts years past. You really put yourself behind the 8 ball here, because especially at the quarterback position, guys, this is a position that you can address later on. It happens every single year. Hell, it happened with Patrick Mahomes last season. He was being drafted as a guy that could potentially burst onto the scene. He wasn't, being drafted in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round. Let's look at even the second scoring fantasy quarterback in 2018. That was Matt Ryan. The number 3 scoring fantasy quarterback, Ben Roethlisberger. Both those guys were, being selected in the 7th, 8th, 9th round, whatever. And you can still get good value on those type of guys in 2019. Matt Ryan's a guy that I think is being undervalued. A Carson Wentz, a Cam Newton, just to name a few guys. A potentially Kyler Murray, rookie guy that's getting a lot of hype. You have to go ahead and identify these quarterbacks that more than likely will be just fine later on. And in the meantime, you build that core roster with those playmakers that are a little bit more valuable at positions that are probably a little bit more injury prone. So you need some of those backups. And look, I get it with the tight end position. Some people might say, well, I'm drafting a tight end early because they might take the place of a wide receiver 1. So that's why I'm doing it. Well, okay, there's some validity to that. I'll give you that. But I think especially in 2019, when the pool of tight ends is so deep in terms of tier 2 tight ends. Guys like Evan Ingram, OJ Howard, Hunter Henry, maybe Jared Cook, Vance McDonald, depending on how you feel about them. You can get those guys after the 6th round. Why wouldn't you do that? Again, build the core of your roster with other players. I'd rather go ahead, in the 2nd round, I'd rather get a Juju Smith-Schuster instead of a Travis Kelce, and then in the 6th or 7th round, then get an Evan Ingram. I think that's a lot better way to do it. Now, speaking of positions, this is a good time to go ahead and address those last 2 positions in kickers and defenses, depending, if your league has kickers or not. But basically, these are the positions that you should not be drafting early on. And it's probably something that no matter how many times we say, you're going to see people do it regardless. Someone is going to go ahead and draft the Bears defense way too early, or take a chance on Greg Zuerlein or Justin Tucker way too early. There's no reason to do that here, folks. The defense and kicker position should be one of the last positions, respectively, that you pick in your drafts, after the 11th, 12th round, whatever it is, because you see it time in and time again. It's all about matchups. You can stream those positions. If there's not a top-notch running back or wide receiver or quarterback on waivers, guess what the top position is? It is defenses, and it's all based on matchups. That is a position you can stream 100% of the time. And there's other leagues that completely have gotten rid of the kicker position just because it's so random and hard to predict in favor of just another flex spot. So don't go ahead and put yourself in a situation where you're taking in a chance on 2 of the biggest question mark positions in the league. They have pretty big fall offs, especially the defense position from year to year. We've seen it time and time again. So don't go ahead and put yourself in that risky situation where you could have gone ahead and gotten another late round talent with a very high ceiling. And speaking of those late round selections, let's examine what you should do in the late rounds instead of maybe going kicker or defense at that point in time in the 11th, 12th round. This is where you want to be going ahead and targeting high ceiling players. Look, they might have question marks, sure, but when it comes to risk in the latter rounds, after the 10th round, it's not really a big deal, because here, even if you go and select a guy and they don't hit, you don't lose out on as much, because the majority of these late round selections won't hit, and they're going to be dropped one way or another off people's rosters. So go ahead and just get guys that have high ceilings, that you think are in good positions, and more than anything, guys that are on good offenses, that are high scoring, and that will have a lot of scoring opportunities. So with that taken care of, let's look at another type of strategy that people sometimes like to employ, and that is stacking guys from the same team. And again, I think this can go ahead and be somewhat controversial, because me personally, I'll go ahead and do a stack, but it won't be a running back and a wide receiver from the same team. Now, I realize that can go ahead and, be a valid thing to do. I mean, hell, back in the heyday of Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown, you'd pay to have that stack. Or, maybe a Julio Jones and Devonta Freeman when he was healthy, something like that. And there will be the cases again this year, Devontae Adams, Aaron Jones, Julio Jones, Devonta Freeman if they stay healthy, James Conner, Juju Smith-Schuster if it all plays out. But my preferred option of the way I like to do stacks is I like one of those stacks to be a quarterback, and then one of the other guys will be a wide receiver or a running back. And the reason I like to do that particularly is because then you get that double benefit. When your quarterback throws a touchdown to one of those guys, well, you get not only the touchdown from the running back or wide receiver, but also from the quarterback. So that's why I personally like that scenario. And look, I realize it does have some risk to it, because if your quarterback has a bad day, well, then more than likely your wide receiver probably had a bad day. That's why I personally prefer the quarterback and running back stack more so than the quarterback and wide receiver stack. Whereas a wide receiver and running back from the same team are a little bit more independent. But at the same time, it's kind of, harder to predict what's going to happen there. So for that reason, again, quarterback, running back, or quarterback wide receiver stack, I think is the way to do it. And again, ideally, these are going to be guys on elite offenses that don't have that many down weeks. You're going to be targeting guys on the Saints, guys on the Chiefs, guys on the Steelers maybe, guys on the Packers, just to name a couple of examples. So Other than that, I would say these are the main points that you guys want to take. If you follow these steps, you're going to come out with a great roster. The last things I want to mention here are kind of more just extra that I think don't really have to be mentioned, but just in case, if you're newer to to fantasy and don't have as much experience, it's worth hearing. So one thing, bye weeks. Bye weeks aren't that big of a deal. A lot of people will say, well, three of my guys have the same bye week. That's awful. I'm not going to draft that guy in the second or third round because they have the same bye week as my first round selection. Absolutely, under no circumstances, do not do that, because ultimately, what you're going to go ahead and give up is probably 1 week of production, but the weeks before and afterwards, you're going to be laughing in the faces of anyone that was worried about bye weeks, because again, it comes to getting the best player available. Next, go ahead and take bias out of it. I understand that a lot of people that might be doing fantasy for the first time, might be doing it because they just are a very passionate NFL fan, and maybe you're the biggest Green Bay Packers fan out there. So you want to go ahead and be a homer and take all the Green Bay Packers out there, but that's not a good way to do it, not in fantasy football. Even if you're a lifelong Packers fan, don't be drafting Aaron Rodgers in the third round or something like that. That's a recipe for disaster. And then the last thing that I'll say here, kind of a one-off, but sometimes you'll see individuals draft maybe like two upper echelon tight ends a little bit earlier on, or with quarterbacks, or those kind of positions where you can get later on. And what they try and do is corner the market there. And the idea is, okay, well, I'm going to use one of these guys as trade bait and then get a lot in return for one of those guys. I'd say stay away from that, because you can never predict how other individuals will value the players that you select. If you're drafting someone as depth that you won't be able to play on a week-to-week basis, that's a top-notch player, don't rely on you being able to get good value in a trade for him. Hell, don't rely on you being able to trade them at all. So I'd say stay away from that type of thinking. Other than that, like I said, though, this kind of wraps up these in-draft tips and pieces of advice that if you guys follow, you're going to come out as one of the top-notch drafters on draft day. And let me know what you guys think. Do you agree, disagree? Are there other draft day tips that I should have included that you swear by? If you have any other fantasy questions, let me hear it in the comment section. And if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys for future videos.